So I'm not going to say much because I think so much has been said, and I'm just going to ask to put two words: where next? And I'm going to start going in the direction that I introduced you to. So start with Yusuf.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So where to next? I'm not going to repeat, but I'm just going to read a few things from setting out the set of global challenges as I see it. And some I'll skip over because we've spoken about all day. But the one we haven't spoken enough about, but in passing we've mentioned it, is the rise of populist authoritarianism globally. And it's a threat we haven't spoken about in education. And there are various reasons it's risen, partly as a reaction to untrammeled neoliberalism and free market orthodoxies. Movements and parties have argued for a slew of reforms. But in education, what this has resulted in, and generally has demonized migrants and refugees, inflamed racist attacks against minoritized groups, and resulted in increased xenophobic rhetoric and violence. It has sought to reassert what I call it has sought to reassert what I refer to traditional values, and its playbook has sought to roll back progressive rights and freedoms. In education, this is what we're seeing in this form. Populist authoritarianism actively undermines discussions of the legacies of slavery and colonialism, discussions of critical race theory, and programs of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Research, teaching, and scholarship about inequities in society, which seek to shine a spotlight on, to name but a few, racism, injustice, and others, have become effectively delegitimated and defunded. And this is quite significant. They lost their mooring intellectually. And more importantly, these ethno-nationalist authoritarian populism, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing of what I mean by that, have appropriated and utilized the language of opposition and the language of progressive ideals. For example, in India, they talk about rewriting decolonial history by writing out from history the Mughal Empire, who they see as colonizations, and decolonization becomes Indianness, which is limited to Hinduism, as articulated by Professor Ramchand. I'll skip war, I'll skip the issue about climate and inequality. I'll also skip the issue about aid cuts. But one thing about aid, just to make the point, is that it's not that aid's being cut, it's that aid is being cut in favor of arming and militarization. That's far more worrying than cut for aid. It's a problem to cut aid, but I actually worry far more about the massive rearmament. When DFID, and I can quote, and I got a lot of data about all the development agencies who are removing aid budgets to militarization spending. If you've seen the Chancellor's speech, the defense budget wasn't cut in the same way. So, and then technology, we've spoken about AI, and I think we need to talk. So what does this mean for real as it goes into the next 10 years? I think it means several things for real. One, I think it needs, for me, is a strong normative commitment to social justice, and in a context of fear, it needs to talk directly and powerfully about repression, and it requires the courage to speak. It is, to paraphrase Paulo Freire, reading the world in order to change the world we inhabit. The value of education as a democratic enterprise is not only deconstructing the world, but crucially its future orientations, as UNESCO knows in its foundation status. If wars are made in the minds of humans, as UNESCO said, then just freedoms begin with education, and it's not about peace, but it's about just peace. There are 6 things that Real Center could do very briefly. One key response of the Real Center would be, it's coming out throughout the day, would be to develop an intersectional and interrelated research, scholarship, and teaching programs to address complex problems because they're not limited or siloed, which foreground equity, social justice. Secondly, it will have to continue to serve as a strong voice and a critical voice for research scholarship in the global south, working with other groups, and that is crucial. At the level of content, I think it implies that the center needs several things in its programs. This includes programs that move beyond the mantra of implementation, science, and what works, important as they be, but to look at the political economy of education reform and the politics of education. For the science of implementation and what works are highly contested and political matters and are not purely technical. Further, at the level of content, the gaze of the real center needs to be on the global north, for we know that inequality is intersectional. The poor are poor not because they're poor, but because the rich are rich, in simple terms. Richard Titmuss talks about the problem of poverty. Poverty is simply the unacceptable face of inequality. Inequality is fundamentally the problem. Therefore, we need to study elites and how elites make policies. We need to study international organizations, and hence that FCDO conference on the international aid architecture need to start with the gaze at itself and the architecture of aid. There is also a need to work around the marginalization whose experience of marginality intersects with markers of inequity, including but not limited to race, caste, disability, gender, location. In other words, I would prefer to not use categories like teachers or girls and women because there's intersections of race, caste, and disability today. And there needs to be strong work around teachers and teacher professionals, which is obviously what I always would say. And addressing these problems need to be located in systems as a whole, from early childhood to higher education and beyond, across both time and space. But I think these are not challenges for real only. They're also challenges for all the professional associations and INGOs or research associations that make up the field. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Just want to congratulate Real Center and Pauline again for 10 years of excellent research that is really moving education in the international world. In terms of what next, yes, a lot has been said today, but from my point of view and my knowledge of the work that Real Center is doing, as well as the partnerships that Essah has with the Real Center, one of the things I would recommend is, having done 10 years, how about some longitudinal studies to look at the impact of your work and your work with partners on education, improving learning, as well as educational systems. So all this work, I mean, where has it been done? What's worked? What hasn't worked? How long has it worked for? And how long will it continue to work? So we can get some data and evidence to really make all this work we've been talking about today here concretized and available for others to also use and learn from. Another suggestion would be, as someone who's worked in different fields, education, I came to education late. I've been working more in health and food security, youth employability, gender. I see these SDGs as interrelated. And in a way, we work on them in isolation, which doesn't really help. So a lot came out today about how education may or may not be seen as directly connected to climate change and environmental change. But actually, there's a lot that education can do to amplify those challenges, and vice versa. How are we using education to teach people about the consequences of climate change? So thinking about ways in which we can better interrelate education to the other areas of sustainable development that can really help education is make a case, but also take advantage of the leaps that other areas have been able to make in terms of, for example, being able to access greater funding for longer periods. If we work together, I think education can do a lot more than it currently does, because our value will be seen, and those indirect metrics that were talked about earlier, we can find a way to get these more direct and more accessible to others who are working in this space. Another area that I think Real is already doing work, including with us at Essah, is a lot has been done to enhance the visibility and the profile of education researchers in Africa. And that is really gaining traction now. But I'm sure we are not the only ones where the researchers are not getting the the visibility that is needed. So is this work something that you can replicate in other regions if needed? Again, working with local partners as we've been doing in Africa. Continuing to advocate for greater investment in these researchers, because the only way we can advance education and international development is by working with people who are within those countries, those regions, to bring in that context-relevant research, data, evidence for decision-making and action. Another area for consideration, which again has come through earlier in the day, is how can we leverage AI and educational technology to carry on what you're doing in terms of access, equitable learning in across the world, really. There are pros and cons to that, but I think the kind of excellent research you're doing here can help identify the pros and cons of the use of AI and EdTech. What can we do to make sure we are not widening the divide, the digital divide, but providing data and evidence that can help those decision makers, those implementers, to be able to come up with relevant guidelines and policies that can be really useful for increasing education access and learning for all children, irrespective of where they are based. Lastly, I think a lot has been done at the Real Center. You just look around and you see the diversity of staff, students. I think that really enriches the work you do here. And we've seen that, we've heard people on the panels, whatever. I think that's something you can really amplify, continue to help others replicate. Even within this university, as you mentioned, I was here working with the Cambridge Africa program. And I think this center is a real example of how, by bringing different minds together, you can really amplify the work, learn from each other, and bring about change. So maybe documenting again whether and how you think this diversity has empowered the work that you do here, and encourage others within the university and outside of it to be able to think about these things when they're recruiting and supporting students. Because you've brought in a lot of talented researchers. And again, when you do your longitudinal studies, maybe looking back, where are they all now? How are they changing the world? Again, to concretize their data and their evidence to showcase the power of international engagement. Lastly, you've shown us clearly here how you work in partnership with others. And I think that's crucial. Nobody can do this work alone. There's a lot to be done, and we're all doing what we can in our own small ways. But I think by coming together, working in partnership, we can really amplify the work that we do. And there's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go with others. Yeah. It lessens the burden. You have companionship as you go along. And I think that's what I'll leave you all with. Let's continue to work together. Thank you.
How much time do I have?
The same as before.
So thank you so much for this, Pauline. As far as where next is concerned, I think we live in incredibly unpredictable times. It's hard for me to predict anything other than the fact that the binaries that have governed international development until now, global north versus global south, donor and recipient, where is knowledge generated, and whose voices count, is changing, and it will completely change. I want to make two broader points and 2 points about the Real Center in particular. The broader points are building from what Amna said about advocacy and the use of research. And I want to talk about 2 of the things that the Real Center have done that have not been mentioned before. One is that even before the funding cuts, there were conversations in donor circles about the potential trade-offs between going to scale and reaching the most marginalized, and how about we reach a greater percentage. And now with the funding cuts, those conversations are going to increase. But there is research that Pauline, Munazza, Shanila, and I and other colleagues have done on how there is still value for money for reaching the most marginalized, and reaching them will lead to benefits for a greater proportion of children as well. The second point is about the cuts in education funding for humanitarian crises. And our UNRWA report that Julia did mention speaks about how education is also pivotal to the survival of children in these conflict-affected states. Now, I mentioned both these works because what we need at this point and where next is advocacy, and advocacy that builds on local, contextually driven research. And that's what we need next. And here I want to shout out to DARE RC, which is based in Pakistan, does locally driven research with Pakistani voices, international partnerships, but elevating Pakistani voices. And if we're going local in the future, if we're not going global, we're going local, then let's do it the way DARE is doing it. And then 2 points about Real Center. First is I am representing early career researcher voices here. In this highly precarious time, we are facing even more precarity with visa issues, funding cuts, a publication process that is highly inequitable. And in that system, Real Center has given us space, it has given us a voice, and it has continued to nurture researchers from the Global South. All of the researchers, early career researchers at the Real Center are from the Global South and from various parts of the Global South. And my hope for the future is that Real Center continues to do that and continues to be a beacon of hope for us researchers. And the second is, and this is, I feel very passionate about this, Real Center has not done just cutting edge policy research, but there is integrity to the research. At a time when there is a lot of silencing and a lot of people are silent, and I understand why. I understand precarity. I have a Pakistani passport. But, but at that time, Real Center was brave enough to speak up and to speak truth to power. And I think that, more than anything else, is its legacy. And I hope that continues for the next 10 years. Thank you.
So I work a lot with the elite, or some of the elite. I think a lot of us in the room do, right? In addition to the list of climate and war and populist authoritarianism, I was chatting recently with a social historian who said we have never before in the world had so few people with so much money. And what happens at the moment in history, perhaps every 100 years ago, when wealth is consolidated in the hands of a tiny few, it's not good for anyone. After a period of deep, profound, global destruction comes the rebirth. And I really hope we're not here in 10 years' time looking back and saying, well, that was even worse than we'd anticipated. So I'm going to end on a hopeful note, because in amidst all of this kind of negativity and kind of doom, which I think, there is a period of grief and doom and stress, and someone said earlier today, Manazir, was it you, what is the kind of goalpost we're working towards? I had a chat yesterday with Emma, who's head of the geography department here, who said, you know what, I feel like we're bringing in undergrads and then teaching them about how the world is really scary, and they're already scared, and then we leave them with like, what do? Go join McKinsey. And so she's crafted a third-year course in hope, which I think is just the most, it's not solutions, it's not answers, because as demonstrated today, we don't have them, but it's the flickering light, the glass half full, that says we believe and we know that things are going to get better and we're working. And I think that is, for at least me personally, the foundation of my kind of sense of being in a way this year has been rocked by why does the rest of the world feel that this is not something to fight for? And the kind of realization that actually, yes, there is hope. There is a massive community. What Steve was saying there about when he talked about the climate community struck me thinking, well, hang on, why do we not all talk about ourselves as the education community? And that's something I often reflect on in education, that we don't speak as a community. We bicker amongst ourselves. But then by the end, I was thinking, well, no, hang on, why are we not describing ourselves as part of the climate community? Because that's what we should be doing, breaking down the silos and taking away the structures and the norms and behaviors of aid. And all of us here, yes, I'm a student of the politics of aid, but all of us in every iota of what we do is shaped by the politics of aid. And if there's one hope I have going forward, it's not that we end up in this binary of, I'm a colonial historian first and foremost, so it was colonialism was awful, now let's move on. Reality is we haven't moved on. Racism and colonialism rule the world still. But let's not do that to aid either. Let's not chuck it out and say the whole thing was awful, every structure and everything was awful. But let's turn away from it, but build from it. And be, I think one of the things we can be attentive to is looking at our own role, our own behavior, and thinking, is what I'm doing part of a learned norm and behavior? There is so much competition for funding more than anything, but for power too, baked into this system. For funders, the funders I work with, we talk about flipping the accountability. In 10 years' time, if we're here, and it's the funders who are being held accountable, did you provide the right money at the right time, to the right things, to the things that we care about? If in 10 years' time we're here talking about that and the whole flipped thing, and funders are not the top of the pyramid, but actually just enabling wider systems. So I think that sort of deep thought and the consciousness that we can shape what comes next. There are many different scenarios. We need spaces like this to challenge our own assumptions about what comes next. Where I hear at the moment lots of talk about there's going to be private sector money in education, or this is the moment for power to shift and finally we'll have localization, or this is now the time to double down on foundational learning versus this is the time to really open up conversation about social and civic and other education. Like, the reality is all of that will continue, and the reality is that we need to be just constantly checking ourselves that we are not falling into the old silos, the old bickering, and trying to move forward with a sense of we're all in this together and we're all building that world of education together. Some very concrete things. I think we are trying to, there's a big we, there's no kind of sense of identity here. I'm an education person, but a lot of the conversations I'm having at the moment are about shifting the meta-narrative on education and using the word education. It means many things to different people. We've got quite stuck in a human capital narrative of education. Let's think about the different purposes. Let's not only defend the FLN versus the EIE versus the ECD and so forth. Let's get the holistic message on education out there, because it's missing, not just from EIE, but from the broader sense. You read The Economist, education is a failed example of what's been done over the last few years. So let's use that meta-narrative, and let's not say it's complex, or it's difficult, or that it takes learning 20 years to happen. It doesn't. It takes 10 days for a teacher to see if learning's happening. So let's be positive and proactive about the education voice, and not only speak about education in the way that we think the economists want us to. The final kind of, I've got one final thing to say about the Real Centre, but the final thing I'll say about broadly education and aid is that, and I want to write a book called The Common Sense Theory, because I think maybe it is because we're so baked into the norms and behaviours of aid, but so many of the interventions or the projects or whatever this awful language that we talk about is, so many of the research papers I've heard at the RISE conferences in particular, year after year, is this didn't happen, this didn't work, we've got 0.1 SD and so forth. But when the kind of explanation came out, I'm sitting there going, well yeah, like a teacher training program didn't work because it was in term time, so the teachers weren't there because they were in classrooms where they should be. Or like, I mean, in a way, the common sense of why were we giving meals only to girls and not boys? And it's some of that, it's common sense theory, but it's because behaviours were baked into certain ways and requirements of these project documents and so forth. How do we get beyond that? How do we stop and pay attention to the common sense theory going forward? And I think for real, like, general message, yes, keep doing what you're doing. Yes, double click on more power and politics. And focusing on the politics and behaviours of those who hold power, because these education systems are for the elite, 20% for the bureaucracy, but how do we shift incentives of that 80%, the ones that at the moment are not in the incentive of businesses, rich people, anyone else to educate? How do we do that? But I think there's a really fundamental kind of actionable question for the Real Centre right now, which is we do know enough to be doing a whole lot more, which is not an intuitive question for a research centre, but it is. I mean, I worked on generating research for many years and making the case that we need to know more, and I think the message has become translated as we don't really know what we're doing. And so how do we consolidate the yes, actually we do, there are some really simple messages with a lot of still academic freedom and questionings and deep academic research to be done, but how do we do that alongside we know enough to be doing a whole lot more than we're doing right now?